Hello everyone, long time no see. Today we're just going to be going over, this is a video I wanted to do for a long time. We're going to be going over RENE GUENON's The Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times. Now, due to the nature of this book being, well, it's not that long, it's just got a lot of information in it, and to put it into a scripted video like I normally would do for a book would just be it would be too tedious, and I think that I'd end up leaving out a lot of important information in the book, and I'd be doing a disservice to everybody watching the video. So I said, I'm just going to take a bunch of notes on the book for this time when I'm reading it, and then I'm going to go over it in a video form like this. It's not my first time reading the book. I've read the book probably 2 other times, and I've written some stuff on it, and I think I think you can only put so much in writing, um, especially like I was writing stuff on like a limited platform, so I didn't get to really express the real detail that was going on here. And I also, when I went over it again, I did notice that there was some important stuff that I did leave out in what I was writing. So I decided, I think I'll just put a video out on YouTube, and hopefully that'll help people. I've seen people make videos on this book before. I've seen John David Ebert do a book series on the Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times. I've also seen, I'm sure a lot of you over here are probably familiar with Chad Haig's YouTube channel, and every once in a while he'll have one of his guests or something come on and make a video. And there's this one guy doing a video on this book, and I do think that both of those video series that were done were, I think they were okay, and I think that you can get a general idea, and it would definitely help you reading the book if it's the first time you read the book. But I do think that they did leave out some important stuff that we're going to end up going over here today. And we do, just to preface this, we do have about 28 pages worth of material to go over. So I don't know how long this video is going to be. This could be anywhere from 50 minutes to 2 hours. So you're going to have to bear with me. And you're also going to have to bear with me because I'm going to be reading off notes, and there's going to be a lot of clicking and pausing, and I'm not going to edit all that footage. It's just going to take too long. So it's just going to be raw, uncut footage for the most part. But yeah, I did do a video on GUENON's The Metaphysical Principles of the Infinitesimal Calculus, which is a book that nobody talks about, and I really do think it's a good book. I think there's a lot of unique and really obvious metaphysical insight in that book that once you read it, you're like, oh, okay, yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. I don't know why no one else has said this before, or why this is not more common knowledge, because if you just follow the logic, to me, 90% of the book it follows through. I mean, there might be some things in there I have a problem with, but I'd have to really think about them to be sure. But yeah, I do find GUENON to have a lot of interesting takes that not a lot of people seem to talk about. Now, that doesn't mean he's a perfect philosopher or anything. He obviously has his issues like all philosophers do. But yeah, I did want to dedicate another one of these videos to him, and I think one of the best books I could go over would be his magnum opus. Now, just to give you a little bit of a background on who Rene GUENON was, and this is going to be short because I know most of you here want to actually get into the material, and we're going to do that in a second. GUENON was a philosopher, and I know some people have a problem with me calling him that, and he might even have a problem with that if he was still around, but nonetheless, he's a philosopher who was really concerned with reintroducing traditional metaphysics into society and traditional understanding of metaphysics. A lot of it's been influenced by Platonism and all that. He's also he can be credited with starting or laying down the foundations for what people call perennialism, which is not the belief, which this is what many people think. It's perennialism is an idea that all religions are the same. That's not what perennialism is. Perennialism is basically the idea that all the religions that exist, that have been revealed to man, so to speak, are valid paths and distinct paths that lead to the one truth, and that the differences between the religions are really only trivial, or they don't matter as much as the one core truth that they all lead one to once they follow the religion. Now, I'm not a perennialist. I do have issues with perennialism. I do think that it's a fallacious way of thinking. However, I'm not going to go into that today. That's not what this video is about. I can do a video on that in the future, and I'll be more than happy to do so. But that's basically who GUENON was. He comes out of France. He was, I guess you could say, he was writing around, the mid 1900s. This book in particular was published, I believe, in 1945. So this was right at the end of World War II for some historical context. Uh, and this is definitely, yeah, this is his magnum opus. If you're going to read any book by him, I would suggest you read this one. Not to say his other books don't matter, but if you want to get a good idea of what he's all about, this is a good book to read. And I would also recommend you read The Metaphysical Principles of the Infinitesimal Calculus, because that book is basically just pure metaphysics, which is what I'm interested in. I'm not really interested in, for the most part, like all the esoteric mythology and religions. I just kind of find it boring, to be honest. I find the pure metaphysical stuff really interesting, like Hegel and Leibniz and Spinoza or whatever, Plato, Aristotle. All that is really what captures my interest, and he goes into that in this book, and he also talks about the mythology as well. We're going to address as much as we can here, and so yeah, just to start, we need to start with the two ontological categories that Guénon divides the world into. So he divides the world into quality and quantity, and this is important to note, because you're going to have to understand these two concepts to understand the rest of the book. So quality is essentially that which is, and I know this kind of speaks for itself, but is not quantifiable. You can't reduce it down to things like matter. You can't reduce it down to things that are measurable or anything really in that sense. I mean, you can still observe qualities, of course, but they're not tangible. So what are examples of qualities? Well, we can say essences are qualities. Universals are qualities. What are examples of essences and universals? Okay, abstract objects, and objects in quotation marks here, because I don't mean objects in the material sense. But what I mean by that is things like the laws of logic, colors. We could say that a cat has its own essence, a catness, a dogness. What else? Hoarseness. These are all things that possess distinct essences, and there are multiple cats, right? But where exactly does the essence of catness lay? Well, you can't. It's not quantifiable. You can't capture. You can't hold it. You can't even observe it under a microscope. Sure, you can observe multiple cats, but in that instance, you're only observing the distinct instantiations of catness. That's basically that's one way we can understand what essence is, and some things, some more, I guess you could say, I don't want to say mythological, but for lack of a better term, I'll just say teleological, more narrative-wise. We can think of things that come from the domain of essence, such as God, angels, and even demons, and all that stuff that exists outside the realm of corporeality. These things are basically not subject to space, time, and extension. However, that doesn't mean that they don't exist within it either. They can exist within it and outside. And God would be a perfect example of such a thing. So now we need to understand quantity, and quantity is a lot easier to understand. Quantity is essentially it's not matter, but matter is it has less of an essence. It has less essential aspects than other objects do. So when we think of quantity, it's associated with the material world. For example, extension, height, length, volume. Those are all things which are quantifiable. Those are measurements. Now, quantity is, how should I say? There's no such thing as quantity without quality. Both of these things are linked together. You can't have either. You can't separate them completely. In order to understand them, you need to basically have the other one that exists to give you some perspective, some contrast with it. Now, Guénon uses, here I'm just going to scroll down, Guénon uses the Aristotelian notions of act and potency to highlight the quantity and quality distinction. As act is quality because it participates in essence, and potency is quantity as it participates in substance. So, okay, now we need to understand essence, which we just associated with quality, and substance we're going to associate with quantity. Now, substance basically it's not matter, and we're going to see this in a second. It's essentially basically this field of, we could say, being that's stripped of all essence, and it's in complete entropy. It has no determination. The only thing that's going to freeze or uh, determine, or I guess we could say particularize quantity, pure quantity in that sense of the word, is going to be essence. You need, and this is basically, you can kind of understand this through the Platonic framework of the um, the realm of being imposing itself on the realm of becoming. It's the same idea essentially. So back to the analogy of act and potency. You can't have act without potency and vice versa because the two are complementary to one another. That's what I was just saying before. So Guénon says that neither pure act and pure potency can exist. Now this is why he can't be a Catholic, because if you know anything about Catholic theology, you'll know that they define God as pure actuality. A really easy way to understand the difference between act and potency is to understand act as the notion of being and potency of becoming. Okay, so that goes back to what I was saying before. I should also add that there seems to be this confusion that people get with act and potency, where they think that because I'm saying that something can potentially happen, that it means it does exist in the present world. Well, the only thing that exists in the present world is the ability for it to happen. So one time I was talking to a friend and I was saying, okay, so you have a white table. The white table possesses the ability to be green, uh, but it's not actually green, obviously. So for some reason, people get confused. It's basically potency just means the potentiality or possibility for an object or something to change, the logical possibility. Now, Guénon also states that he sees quality as the superior to quantity. And to understand this, we need to understand the Platonic great chain of being, where we see immaterial things and more unified things as being higher and even more moral, rather than material things that have an aspect of multiplicity. So there is this Platonic presupposition here that that which is unified, that which is brought back into the one, is somehow superior to that which is divided and multiplied. Now, he also wishes to make a distinction between the modern concept of numbers and ideas as opposed to the older and more perennial ones, whereas the older conception of numbers were ones of pure quality, imposing itself into quantity. And I'm going to pause here. Now, with the old understanding of numbers, yeah, we had, let's take the number 5. The number 5 is a universal category. It exists everywhere at all times. Now, you could have multiple instantiations of 5. You can have 5 cars, but 5 cars is not actually equal to 5-ness or the essence of 5. So in modern times, we kind of have a blind spot when it comes to this metaphysical issue. We just conflate numbers with like a nominal notion of numbers. We say, oh, well, we're just imposing 5-ness onto reality, when in actuality it doesn't exist. But no, that's actually not true. These things, there could be no reality for us to even have the ability to impose anything on if it wasn't for these forms in the first place to generate a world which is intelligible and distinct, that allows for knowledge. That's essentially what I would say, and I'm sure he would say the same thing. Now, so yeah, we in the past we viewed numbers as pure quality imposing itself into quantity, not the other way around, like many materialists would assert. Numbers even had esoteric meanings applied to them, and we see this a lot with the Pythagoreans and all those cults in ancient Greece. Guénon's issue with the contemporary notion of matter is essentially he takes issue with the notion of matter because in the modern sense of the term, and he prefers once again the more perennial notion, which would be substance. And the difference between the two would be that matter is defined as something very particular, like atoms, for example. Now, typically a plane of atoms or subatomic particles, these all are defined in particularized definitions, whereas substance is still a quantitative element. However, once we introduce atoms, we introduce the imposition of essences on substance. So exactly, atoms have their own identity, their own restricted, particularized identity, and that basically, in a sense, does not allow for what the physicists would call entropy or pure potency. That can't exist. Nothing can be purely potent if it is in any way restricted. So we can't say matter is without essence because atoms have an essence, and substance would be some kind of universal which is quantitative. So yes, substance is also universal, but it's only known to be quantitative when an essence is imposed on it. So we can't really know about universal substance until it is particularized. So it's a sort of quantitative potency. We don't really have, we can't, it's hard to define, but basically, uh, you can only come to know uh, substance when it is particularized. You need the particularization of substance to know the existence of substance. Basically, you need this metaphysical process to occur in order to have a coherent epistemology about the certain uh, metaphysical substrate you would call a substance. So it's impossible to imagine this because the act of imagining it imposes an essence upon it. Yeah, exactly. We can't fathom any notion of such an object without essence, because essence is, no pun intended here, so essential to our understanding. And this is also why he would conflate it with the, or not conflate it, but relate it with the divine, is because there is nothing that's purely devoid of essence uh, in the corporeal world entirely. Even, well, we would say that pure substance is devoid of essence, but in a way, it's inferior, is what I'm saying. So in order to understand it, we must understand it through essence, which is akin to saying we can only know form. We can only know the form uh, from upward instead of going downward. So we need to understand being rather than through immanence. We need to understand it through transcendence. So matter, in the modern sense, would have to be a materia secunda, which is a scholastic term, I believe, as it is endowed with properties, and properties presuppose essence. Yeah, so any properties, any attributions you can give to an object presupposes essence and thus distinction. Whereas universal substance, or materia prima, is devoid of all quality, so it wouldn't work. And like I just mentioned before, physics has yet to understand the notion of materia prima, which is, once again, pure quantity or substance, or the substantial pole. Individuation that is distinct between objects would have to presuppose essence, which also allows them to be distinct. Yeah, that's right. So if you have objects that are being divided and distinct, well, the only thing that can distinguish things is essence opposing itself on substance. Now, later we'll see that, because you might be confused here. Well, you just said that essences are, or sorry, you just said that essence is what is good and superior to quantity, but you also said the same thing is the case with unity. Unity would be superior to uh, multiplicity, and multiplicity would be associated with quantity. How can you have essences be superior and also have essences be distinct? Because the distinction uh, would contradict the notion that unity is superior. Because how could you have distinction in the superior domain of being? Well, the answer to that is that they're only distinct when they impose themselves on quantity. By themselves, they all end up being the same. Now, I think that's actually flawed. But we'll get it. That's, my personal opinion about that's not really important. We're just going over the work here. So, where are we? This also doesn't allow for inert matter, because inert matter would be matter in absolute potentiality. But because it has a determination, it can't be absolute potency, which is what I was talking about before. And I just want to apologize if I repeat something. It's probably because I said it before I go over the note that addresses it, and I just remember it from reading it. So if I do repeat it, please please bear with me here. So GUENON also states that the contradiction that scientists on their own presuppositions have to appeal to, which is that outside the senses, such as pure potency, to have their notion of inert matter, so they have to presuppose something that they cannot observe, which doesn't really work with empiricism. But their rejection of materia prima doesn't allow them to have such a notion. Yeah, so you can't have inert matter because you can't have something that's in constant motion or in constant potentiality that's particularized. That's the key issue here. There's also a modern epistemic issue where they collapse quality and quantity, making them one thing, and this comes from their empiricist epistemology, where only the sensible is real, and they then conflate the sensible world with what we know, or with what we now just call matter. So this confusion really has its roots in Descartes, and he critiques Descartes a lot in this book, and Enlightenment Metaphysics, where we see the birth of what GUENON calls basically the shift from materia prima being a universal quantitative substance to being equated with extension and atomism. Both, once again, fall flat as they presuppose quality, and also with atoms, which are said to be final elements or elements which are not divisible. The contradiction is basically that these elements can't be extended, since extension itself presupposes division. So you can't have these, according to him, you can't have atoms because atoms, being objects that are extended in space and time, in order for them to be extended, you would have to be able to divide them. So you can't have something that's extended and not divisible. That would be a contradiction in terms. So extension always presupposes division, not indivisibility. Analogically speaking, we could call quality masculine and quantity feminine, as quality imposes itself and is more dominant onto its submissive quantity, which is always in flux and always in motion. So time and space for GUENON are linked, and one can't measure time without measuring space due to the fact that they're linked. Space can't be measured without time, as when you measure an object, it presupposes that this object's identity remains the same as it exists through time. Yeah, so there's this presupposition that an object retains its identity as it shifts through time. Now, obviously, materia prima can't be measured because it has no distinction, right? You can't measure something that's not, first of all, distinct, and also you can't measure something that's constantly moving. It has no identity because then you wouldn't be measuring the same thing in one instant and then in the next. And to measure presupposes a distinct object which has, its existence by other objects being distinct around it to contrast its individuation. Number cannot be measured as it is a quality. However, when we do measure anything, number is presupposed and expressed in the measurement because we are measuring the unification of quality onto quantity. So it's an image, and that is the image of quality will be expressed through, or I should say, through or into quantity. So anytime we measure something, we're going to be measuring it with number, but it's because number is that which is imposing itself onto quantity, coming from a higher domain of being, essentially. A crucial distinction must be made, and that is, GUENON states that quantity is not that what is being measured, rather it is how something is being measured. So if I said otherwise, I apologize. So when any measurement is being done, it presupposes quantity in some sense. So even things like height and width have an aspect of quality because they're distinct from one another. Height and width are not the same thing, so there must be some essence that imposes itself in order to make these things distinct. When we use these things or measure them, they are an expression of quantity because they are particularized. Ontologies conjoined once again with an essence. Distinct objects are determinations particular to a specific type of existence, or what we call the corporeal or tangible world. Quantity is also the determination of the tangible and corporeal world. When something is quantified, it is simultaneously qualified, because in order, once again, to have the distinction within quantity, you need to have essence impose itself on it, and then you have a kind of quantity that is also distinguished because essence imposes itself on it. So it's distinguished through essence, while nonetheless still having a quantitative aspect as well as an essential one. Measure is connected with that of order, as measure is a result once again of quality being imposed on quantity. We have this perennial notion of order being imposed on chaos or brought out of chaos from a higher order. The non-measurable is the infinite, which we can't really define because to define it is to limit it, obviously, and the infinite is the source of the indefinite and the finite. And the distinction between the indefinite and finite is that the indefinite is just a continuous quantitative determination. So it's a measurable continuity with determined elements such as number. Of the continuity, and the finite is just discontinuous quantity. My video on GUENON's the metaphysical principles of the infinitesimal calculus actually goes all into that. So you can go back a couple videos and you'll get the gist of that idea if you're confused. Disciplines like geometry, which one can say to be the science of measure, are quantitative but also have a qualitative nature, such as sacred geometry and certain kinds of architecture being a reflection of the divine. This also falls back into the imposition of quality once again, being imposed on quantity. Geometry has a lot of qualitative roots. Extension is a form of quantity, but not a pure form, because extension, to be extension as a distinct thing, must have a qualitative aspect to it as well. So moving on here, Guénon now speaks of the qualitative aspects of space and time. He says Descartes' notion of empty space is an issue because emptiness presupposes its opposite, which would be fullness, and you can only have an empty thing if it is contrasted with something that is not empty. So Guénon states that extension once again has a qualitative element, and even though this is the case, objects can't be reduced to extension because extension, for the most part, just describes their quantitative elements, despite in itself having an aspect of quality, like we just mentioned before, as extension has a nature and essence and is definable. So it's still, once again, in some sense, qualitative, but it's in the lowest sense of quality. It's the furthest away from the qualitative or essential pole. So distance between objects is quantitative, but it's not enough alone to describe the relations between objects. So you need something more than distance to describe their relation. Objects also relate on a level of essence, obviously. There's a distinction between me and a cat. So the distinction between me and a cat is more than just how far away we are or how close we are. It's also things like the shape of our bodies, the color of our bodies, or whatever. So one thing should be noted here, and that is the underlying presupposition of contemporary science is that space is homogeneous. It's one single unit, and Guénon rejects this. Once again, he prefers universal substance as opposed to space, because space, to be space, is something that is extended, which once again can't be any supposition of pure quantity. He makes a great point that just because two objects possess the same quantity, it doesn't follow that these objects are the same. He uses the example of a square and triangle with equal area not being the same in a qualitative sense. This follows, as we can obviously see, that you can have one large triangle and one small triangle, but nonetheless both possess the same essence despite different determinations of size. And they also will change in some sense because the size also has an essential notion as well. Furthermore, space is in itself qualified because space can only exist with distinct directions, and once again, distinction entails qualities. Exactly. So you can't have space without the different objects around to give the appearance of space. Basically, objects create their own space. Furthermore, Guénon also critiques Kant's antinomies, that being, is space infinite or whether it is finite and limited by space. Guénon's first critique is that the notion of space being limited by itself is a contradiction, as how can space extend past itself to contain itself? If it extends past itself but is containing it, then you are saying it is contained but not contained, as it possesses the ability to surpass itself. So yeah, like how can you say, this thing contains itself when it is outside of itself in terms of a quantitative ontology? That which limits something must not be subject to what it is limiting. That makes sense. How can you, let's use an analogy here. If I am, and this is almost like a tautology at this point, but basically, if I have you against a wall, right, and I'm limiting you from moving, well, I can't be subject to you, because then if I was subject to you, then I would no longer be limiting you. So that's the issue. It's almost like an analytic truth at this point. A room is only closed because other things exist outside of it. And if space contains itself, then it would be containing empty space, and there can't be such a thing as empty space. It's a false notion, because if it has existence, it can't be empty by definition. And emptiness can't contain anything by definition, so how can space contain space if space is some empty ontology? This is a contradiction. Yeah, you can't have empty space, or it's basically just saying, yeah, we have no space, but you're at the same time calling it a form of space. That's what you're saying. It doesn't make it doesn't make sense, but just because it doesn't make sense doesn't mean it's not true. Rather, it's logically incoherent. So space exists in the world, Guénon states. It's an ontology that is immanent rather than transcendent, which makes perfect sense. Space is not infinite, as it is determined, and there may be an infinite amount of possibilities in spatial manifestation. However, only a specific type can be actualized at once, excluding other possibilities from being actual. Guénon also attacks the antinomy of whether or not the world is eternal or had a beginning. Then the main issue is that once we speak of time, time always begins or presupposes the world, and it's a contingent factor. So no matter what, the world, even if always existing, has no principle in itself. Uh, it is a contingent ontology. It's nothing that's really self-subsistent. It's contingent. So time must have its roots within the world and as a worldly concept, so the universe isn't really eternal, so to speak. Uh, Moving on to the qualitative notion of time, Guénon states that time and space are united, and we see this when we find out that it is not possible to measure time without first measuring space. And this is because space is a more tangible ontology to grasp. So whenever time is being measured, we are just measuring the amount of time it takes to get from one object to another, or from one state of being to another. I say this because if I sit around all day and I still experience time if I sit around. The movement of mental content, essentially. If I measure time with a clock, I am measuring it via the movement of the hands on the clock. So, yeah, basically time, in order to measure time, we're always going to be, in fact, or rather entrenched in space to measure time. Now, that doesn't mean they're the same thing. It just means that they're very united, and you can't really measure one without the other. However, Guénon does make a distinction that what is present within both time and space is what we call corporeal, and mental content, or what he just calls the mental order, things like thoughts and ideas, are not corporeal, as they are not extended in space. However, they are subject to time. So that's interesting. So, and this is kind of obvious when you think about it. If I'm thinking about, I don't know, going to the park. Well, going to the park, the idea of going to the park. Okay, well, it takes time to think of that idea. I'm thinking of a certain series of events of going to the park, walking out my door, whatever happens. But the actual idea itself is nowhere located in space. It's not tangible. You can't measure it. You can't put it in your hands. You can't contain it anywhere. Now you can just say, oh well, it's just a product of brain matter. But even if that's true, right? It's still not associated. It's still, well, it is associated, but it's not reducible to the brain matter, because the brain matter and the thought are not the same thing. So time itself, or sorry, I just said that. Space and time are very similar in that space contains all bodies and time contains all events. So these space and time are both presuppositions that are needed to have corporeality, or the world in which we currently inhabit right now. Kant often speaks about this in the sense of the categories of our perception, but for Guénon, these are obviously more than just mental categories. These are real, concrete, objective ontologies. Just like we don't have empty space, because empty space would be a contradiction due to the fact that space is by definition something with existence. So it can't be empty. That would be saying, once again, it doesn't have a real existence, as space is itself an object. Even if the distance is between two objects, there is no distinction. The distance is still an object. So one of the more obvious ways in which we see the difference is that time contains distinct events, and these distinct events, by virtue of distinction, are qualitatively different. So there is a difference between me eating dinner today and me eating dinner tomorrow. There is something about it. There's a different essence to each of these things. So Guénon addresses the objection to the aforementioned, the objection being that it is not time that is qualitative here, rather it is the events that occur within time that are. And the reply to this would be that time itself is actually the cause of distinction, because, or distinction rather, in the corporeal and temporal world, obviously. Because even if two events are almost identical, the very notion of two events is itself qualitative. So yeah, the distinction between event 1 and event 2 presupposes a distinct essence. Once again, eating dinner last night and eating dinner tonight are two distinct things, which presuppose a temporal separation. So determination, as in order to be two events, they must be distinct in some way. So anytime there's determination, there is distinction, essentially. Events in themselves are a qualitative thing, and time is their cause. So therefore, the cause is also qualitative. So you have something, causes must, in their effects, must have some what's it called, some likening to one another. There must be, some sort of reflection of the cause in the effect. This is a perennial metaphysical principle. That doesn't mean it's true, but this is just to give you an understanding of where that's coming from. So a difference between here with time and space is that time, which produces events, the events cannot change once they occur. So they are more fixed, whereas with space, the bodies have the ability to move and such that they are more flexible. And this is further proof that time is qualitative as it resembles the realm of being because it's fixed. So Guénon also attacks the modern conception of linear time, which represents itself as something occurring in a uniform and straight fashion, whereas he states that cycles are a more appropriate form of temporal representation. Linear time is often thought to be the actual view of time, probably due to the fact that from a phenomenological perspective, that's how we experience it, right? We always experience time in our day-to-day lives as event 1 followed by event 2 by event 3 and so on and so forth. Cyclical time contains ages, and these ages are qualitative as each cycle contains distinct events particular to each age. He states that the speed of time in each is a perfect example of this. And he's not talking about the speed of objects moving in space, rather he's talking about the speed of rapidity of events occurring. So this is the basis for the end of the world, which we're going to see later. As time gets faster, the quicker, we see that the end is near. So moving on here. Analogically speaking, we can see the notion of time speeding up to its end as the same as bodies speeding toward their downfall. This is once again another relation. So a relation between time and space, I mean. So this is a very interesting idea where we see before things come to an end, they speed up. There's a sort of acceleration before destruction. Guénon also states that toward the end of a cycle, we see that things become more quantified. And this is not just a human phenomenological thing, it's also a real change in the environment. So there's an actual literal solidification, a separation of quality from quantity. Guénon talks about individuation. Species belong to essence, and individual belongs to substance. So the basically universal belongs to essence, particular to substance. Now, not pure substance, obviously, because you can't have an individual without determination, and therefore essence, but individual is more substantial than universal. Universal is more essential, essentially. Species is qualitative, and what allows members of different species to be individuated is actually quantity. And in this case, materia secunda, and in the modern sense, matter. Quantitative multiplicity and special sepravity is what distinguishes them. There are also qualitative as well, obviously, but quantity does play a major role here. Quantity can only separate objects, and it can't unite objects, whereas quality can do both, as you have distinction but also unification. So, in a sense, well, quantity, pure quantity, doesn't really do anything. It just kind of moves. It's just kind of, well, moving is something, but it doesn't really do much, I should say. Quality is unified, but it separates. All that can happen to quantity is separation, no unification, because it's already just this potent ontology. Now, it's important, remember, don't think of it as matter, because matter is also something that's determined and has an essential aspect. So Guénon now contrasts uniformity and unity. He offers us a symbol to understand this, a triangle with, at the apex, a representation of pure quality, and at the bottom of the triangle, a representation of pure quantity, which is also where multiplicity lies, and the end of the triangle must have an indefinite multitude, as pure quantity can never be reached. However, it may seem like we are in a world of pure quantity because we are losing our view of quality. We're becoming more and more separated. Uniformity is a quantitative reduction of bodies to a single homogeneous unit, which is entirely deprived of quality. The most obvious attempt at this would be the ontological notion of matter or atoms, and we already showed how matter even has a qualitative aspect to it, once again through determination. A good refutation is Leibniz's quote-unquote principles of indiscernibility, which says that no two objects, no matter how alike, can be exactly identical, because if they were, they would not be two, but rather one, as two implies division and division implies difference. This contemporary metaphysical position basically affects the social outlook on things, especially government and education. If we assume that all beings are identical, we assume that all can participate in government equally, and also that uniform education can be placed upon them because of this. The doctrine of equality leads to neglect, Guénon states, because it presupposes that we all have the same needs. This also leads those who hold this doctrine to imprint their whole notion of equality across the whole world, and we see this today in the neoliberal globalism. And I'm sure people might have an issue with the term with neoliberal. I do plan on actually interviewing someone about neoliberalism in the foreseeable future here. Anyway, this will to uniformity also always works downward towards quantity, like all modern ailments do. It's never anything aimed at the higher, always the lower. Uniformity is a sort of parity of unity, or an inversion, if you will, and this works because of the analogical relation between the two. Unity is transcendental and is not reducing objects to their quantitative determinations. Rather, it allows different things with different qualities, despite their differences, to become one with another and closer to God. Guénon talks about the difference between the ancient crafts and modern industry. The first difference is that ancient crafts were qualitative, and that the person working on the crafts delivered something special and unique to the human condition, or special and unique from the human condition, this was reflected within their product. Their work was united with their soul, and they were not alienated from their work. Modern man is alienated from his work, and he is also entirely replaceable. There is no reflection of his soul in his work, and this is because he is working with modern machines which do not care about the quality of production. Rather they care about getting as much out as possible. So once again, quantity triumphs over quality. Guénon also points out that work was considered religious back then, as religion is permeated through the entire soul of a person, and even mundane things had a religious aspect. So he's talking about everyday life would have a religious aspect. This is reverse nihilism, as all things have meaning. Now, even though some people still are religious, they push religion off into a very private corner and something secluded from the rest of everyday life. It seems to be this kind of restricted thing, which was not how it was treated in the past. Also, modern man thinks that he can take on any profession, but he doesn't realize that professions are not something you can interchange. Rather, your profession must be a reflection and united to your own soul and essence of what you are. Guénon states that if this behavior becomes bad enough, it'll affect the cosmic order, as all things in reality are related by rigorous correspondences. Man has to act in accordance with his essence, and the cause of this is the outlook of uniformity, which we just spoke about. Now, a quick comment on the world is metaphysically affected by the way man acts because of the rigorous correspondences. Well, a perfect example I could point you to is what happened in the Garden of Eden. Obviously, the sin of Adam and the fall of man was a result of man's actions and rebellion toward God. Now, that affected the whole metaphysical situation which we currently inhabit. So that's kind of what he's talking about. If man takes a qualitative view of his work, and thus an initiatic one, his interior soul corresponds and affects his exterior labor, and the two are united. Guénon speaks about anonymity now. In art, he talks about how art in the Middle Ages was generally anonymous, and that now, with the advent of individualism, we see an attempt to get rid of anonymity by signing paintings. Now, there is also modern forms of anonymity, and these forms are present because the person who is anonymous is so because they don't really mean anything in relation to the work. There's nothing reflected in them, in the work that comes from them. Whereas in ancient times, they were anonymous even though they did something in relation to the work. However, the person was anonymous because they were through themselves reflecting the divine in their work. So their ego was not associated because something higher than themselves was enchanting them and working through them to produce something. And this doesn't mean it can happen to anyone. These people have a genuine calling to do such work, as we established previously. So just because, like now we have this idea that because we're all equal, we can all take on the same profession, but back then this was not the case. The distinct essences between people, the inequality, basically allowed for people to have different professions that were suited to them, to their essence. The artist is anonymous because he complies to the divine order, and his ego is negated while participating in it, which isn't to say his being is negated. Rather, it is to say he is brought into unity with the divine through his work. Once again, modern man is anonymous because there is nothing in his work that is him, and his soul is even degraded by this. To sum this up, qualitative anonymity is one in which the ego is dissolved because man acts in correspondence with his nature, and the divine order works through him, and he expresses this in his work, and it is still part of him, but a higher part of him. In the inferior case, he is anonymous because he is seen as a unit that can be replaced, and his work is concerned with quantity and mass production for its own sake. So Guénon critiques the notion that all things can be explained by statistics. This is just another reduction of things to quantity and number, quantitative number, that is. He talks about how statistics can only give us a general idea and not a certainty about anything really. And due to the Leibnizian principles of indiscernibles, one cannot say all causes and effects are the same, for the plurality entails difference. Stats can never give us anything exact or concrete, since facts work through an interpretive framework, and many theories can fit the facts, and the facts themselves are laden with presuppositions. No brute facts exist. We often Quine talked about this. Now, you might be wondering, how can no brute facts exist? Well, let's surely you might say something like, well, obviously there's a tree in front of me. You see the tree, I see the tree. It's a brute fact that that tree exists. Well, okay, it can be a fact that a tree exists, and I'll agree with you, but it's not a brute fact, because when we see the tree, we're not just understanding the tree. We're presupposing that the tree's identity remains the same through time. We're presupposing time. We're presupposing that logic is there to ground the tree. So there's a bunch of presuppositions that go into existence that presuppose, or sorry, rather that we presuppose in order for the tree to exist in the first place. So we have to assume a bunch of things before we can even have these facts. So the use of calculations gives to the statistician a false sense of certainty or exactitude. Guénon states that unity and simplicity, as understood in the modern sense, are a product of lazy thinking, as all moderns think that nature must be simple in order to understand it. But this is a non sequitur. Just because we understand something doesn't make it simple. We can understand complex things. Unity cannot be the amalgamation of parts, as that is not what unity is. Rather, it is the mind imposing unity on parts. So this is the case. Sorry, let me just go over that. Unity cannot be the amalgamation of parts, as that is not unity. That would be uniformity. Rather, it is the mind imposing. It is the divine mind imposing unity on parts, I think is what I meant to say there. In the case of atoms being considered an indivisible unit, it's problematic because extended objects are indefinitely indivisible by logical necessity. Because if they're extended, they must be, by definition, divisible, because you can't have it's just a tautological truth, honestly. Because any object with a volume or area can logically be divided. So there is no reason that an atom can't be either, as it has volume among other quantitative and extended properties. So Guénon critiques Protestantism here because he sees it as a modernizing religion, which got rid of all religious content such as symbolism and iconography and replaced it with a notion of primitive spirituality, aka simplicity. But this is in no way quote-unquote simplicity in the real sense of the term. Rather, it's an inverted notion that is less better, and at the same time progress is better, as Protestantism is a reflection of quote-unquote progress in the modern sense of the term. Now, principal unity or qualitative unity, unlike uniformity, contains all essences of manifestation. Real unity is that which all quality subsists, or rather transforms into, and is freed from all limitation. So the essences come out from the many back into the one. That's the Platonic notion. So this is basically the Neoplatonic notion of the one and the many, or the one going back into the many. Now, when one enters the domain of manifestation, and especially the created world, limitation becomes more prominent because of the fact that things become particularized even more as we descend into quantity. Eventually, things logically just come back into universal substance, which is once again pure quantity and potency devoid of all quality. Modernists try to simplify religion to a literal doctrine, and they also have a tendency to view religious people as stupid or simple-minded, and that religion must therefore uh, follow a simple path. Ultimate simplicity is beneath all manifestation, uh, rather than within it. Guénon touches on the modern phenomena, which is the hatred of secrecy, or what one may call esoteric knowledge, hidden from the masses and left to the few elect to know. This phenomenon comes from the reduction of all things back to quantity and democratization of knowledge. Uh, it assumes that because all humans are equal, we can all learn this stuff and can all handle this esoteric or this information, but and especially know what to do and how to treat this information responsibly when that's not the case. So because of the masses spreading all this esoteric knowledge, it becomes oversimplified, and thus it becomes detached from the nuanced and original or primordial meaning which it actually has. Guénon's metaphysic is cyclic, as we mentioned before. So he would also state that out of all times, it is the worst to democratize knowledge because profane man is not ready for it, or even if he wants it, or he even wants it, he doesn't. Modern man doesn't care about esoteric knowledge really. Uh, he even says that esoteric doctrines are not even meant for the common man, let alone modern man. So yeah, you even in like some kind of golden age or whatever, esoteric knowledge wouldn't be for a normal common person because it's people aren't equal. There's only a certain amount of people who can understand this knowledge and know what to do with it. So modern science prides itself on publishing information in mass and calls it a principle, but Guénon critiques this and calls it a lack of principle, actually. He also states, however, and it makes sense that science would do this as there is nothing there worth keeping secret and no proper elite can use this. I do think it should be stated here that scientism is used as a weapon by the elites while they themselves believe in inverted esoteric notions. He's also going to touch on this later. There can be no accommodation between the traditional forms of knowledge and the contemporary one, as the latter, or modern one, is in essence directly opposed to traditional epistemology. Let's see here. Guénon also says that if all knowledge becomes public, it follows all things should become public. And this, he said, would lead to a world where all live in glass hives and share their meals, and all this lack of secrecy, etc. However, he states the modern world holds a secret, and that secret is the destruction of all things sacred, and they won't tell us that, and this is a secret despite saying secrets are bad, so we don't suspect them of making secrets. So basically, they're trying to say, secrecy is bad in order to make people not think that secrets are going to be being made by the elite, because why would the elite do anything bad? This is the naive view of the world. So they're trying to make secrets look or stigmatize them, make them a taboo so no one really suspects anyone of doing them. Now, I do find it interesting, considering this book was written in 1945, about the whole glass hives and sharing their meals and the lack of secrecy. Well, that kind of translates into that meme we're seeing of, live in the pod and eat the bugs. So you could see how far back this issue, this fear in people goes. So modern rationalism negates all intuitive reasoning, preferring sense data over it. And by intuitive, Guénon doesn't just mean how we feel, he means the ability to use reason alone and come to conclusions from principles alone, or a priori reasoning rather, or what one may call speculative reasoning. So it's speculation rather than rather than observation. If we deny speculation, we deny all metaphysical propositions, and thus are only left with the sensible world. And like I said before, if you deny metaphysical propositions, you can't really make a coherent doctrine of anything, because even if we are an empiricist, we still presuppose things like the laws of logic and time and space, and all of these are not, you can't sense space as universal, nor can you sense time as universal, nor can you sense the laws of logic as universal. Those are not something that, those can only be sensed in a particular manifestation. It's what Hegel would call the lowest form of reasoning. So A mistake, he points out, is also again in Descartes, is the reduction of human bodies to extension. Now, human bodies are extended, obviously. We exist in time and space, but they also possess a bunch of other qualities. He takes issue with modern psychology, which presupposes all men are equal, but this is simply a result of European psychologists studying modern European minds. So it's not going to apply to all ethnicities. However, as we descend toward quantity, all qualities and differences start to disappear. So the hypothesis isn't, in that sense, completely false. Uh, as the world gets more metaphysically degraded, there is going to be this uh, kind of indistinguishability, quantitatively speaking. Reason is, in the modern sense, rejects any relation uh, of basis in the divine order, and thus it becomes attached from the higher and can only head in one direction, which is the lower, and thus quantity. Modern physics can never explain things in terms of essence or in terms of what they really are. All modern physics can do is explain what is occurring at the level of representation, or what it is that we are observing, but it can't say anything about its essence or ontological status as a whole, because it reduces all things to the lowest common denominator, which is the here and now and the particular. So yeah, it can really only explain what's occurring rather than the principles behind what's occurring, because principles always presuppose, or actually not even that they presuppose, they are metaphysical. uh, they are epistemologically metaphysical endeavors, is what I'm trying to say here. All it can do is explain what is happening before us, and not the reason why it's happening is the point. So Descartes' view of bodies being just extended in animal and machines, along with the fact that the extension is more fundamental than the qualitative aspects, leads to the modern notion of materialism. So yeah, here we have this introduction of extension being the final property, or the most essential property. That's where materialism comes in, because atoms are basically just extension. Uh, After Descartes saw the world could be holistically explained through mechanism, from here on he tried to improve the aforementioned notion. Many materialists, like the rationalists, hold their worldviews without knowing it. In the previous case, which we went over, the rationalist called himself a free thinker, while being subject to all modern prejudices, while the materialist, typically a scientist too, just assumes this thing to be the case. And the same goes for common man. They just assume that the sensible and extended world is all that there is, because it's what's immediate to them. Even the scientist is religious when they do their scientific work. They still assume the materialist presuppositions, which in turn just shows their work to be indistinguishable from modern materialists. Uh, I should say, sorry, even if the scientist is religious, they still act as a materialist in their work. Modern man's field of perception has become disoriented and degenerate. He no longer can experience or see things beyond the senses, and this is what Guénon calls the illusion of ordinary life. This lack of sense just reinforces the profane point of view that nothing transcends immanent reality, spatial reality also. Ordinary life is defined as the phenomenological experience that life is something in which nothing that is human or natural can intervene. It's the typical view of that most people have now, like, oh, all that, mystic, all these mystical miracles, all that stuff. Just, maybe that happens, but it's not really a common occurrence or whatever, or it's not something that we really have any evidence of. This is why people don't believe in, you know, this is one of the biggest issues for religion, is this whole idea of ordinary life. Guénon makes a point in saying that ordinary life presupposes that any supernatural ontology is strange or unaccustomed, but nothing can be further from the truth, as all supernatural beings, take God for example, are more primordial than the corporeal order which we inhabit, and this is the case because we are contingent, God is not. So yeah, there's this conflation of, it's an inversion, that which is contingent and is not principled is that which is necessary in principle. And this illusion comes from, first of all, the false metaphysical doctrines, and also the whole idea that we're just accustomed with this everyday world, so we take it for granted as being more primordial, when in fact it's actually inferior and less primordial. A profane domain of being does not exist, but only things oriented away from the sacred, according to Guénon. And this makes sense since the roots of manifestation is divine and it has control over all. So when it creates something contrary to its nature, which is good, in fact, it can't do such a thing. Now, this is like basic Christian, especially Orthodox Christian metaphysics. Is like evil is uh, it exists, but it exists in a shadow sense. It's illusory. It's not really. It doesn't have any strong, essential or necessary pole of existence like the good does. So things become seen as ordinary as little by little their traditional nature is eroded, and the new profane one, after a long period of social marination, is perceived as "quote unquote" normal, when in fact it's not normal, because it's not. Because what's truly normal is what's primordial, which transcends time and space and all this. Likewise, people tend to adopt materialism as they see it as pragmatic, and they just find it easier to believe in this, and it reinforces their materialist worldview. So materialism is really just a result of lazy thinking. And that's not to say that all materialists don't have good arguments or anything. It's just saying that most people who are materialists tend to be lazy in thought. They also adhere to materialism because it also allows them to view the world in a systematic way. But just because something allows you to view the world in a certain way, it doesn't mean that it is that way. Yeah, so that's, just because you can coherently view the world in a certain way doesn't necessarily follow that the world is that way. It could be coherently true that, I don't know, Lord of the Rings is real, right? Well, okay, it's coherent, but it doesn't mean that it's actually true. So, and I would even say materialism is not coherent. It has a whole bunch of other impossible metaphysical issues for it not to exist. So, where are we here? Some of the enlightened, or Guénon would call the elect, would, to the surprise of the contemporary, be entrenched within a form of ordinary life contrary to the modern notion of it. Which is to say, basically, that some people are in a constant state of spiritual and religious infatuation, which to them is what is ordinary. And Guénon would say, authentically so, because it's older and more primordial. So while many have the illusion of ordinary life, what they consider extraordinary will have some unanticipated influence. So yeah, we're going to talk about this later in the Great Fissures in the Wall, which is a great chapter. He also talks about the degradation of coinage and how coinage used to have a spiritual element, such as having a god on the coin, and the people exchanging the coin would feel the presence of a deity while doing monetary transactions. And the lack of this now leads to money once again being seen as something where all that matters is amounts and rates of exchange, also irrespective of whether or not exchanges are moral, and this is because of the lack of divine presence. Guénon introduces the concept of the solidification of the world, which we're not going to get into, or which we're going to get into here in a second, rather. But he also wants to make clear that the spiritual world and the corporeal world are not separated as many think they are. Rather, they're deeply interconnected, and they have a relationship where one is reacting to the other. This doesn't mean they're equal, as the spiritual domain is more powerful and the corporeal is imprinted on. So just they're united, but they're not equal. Let's see here. So yeah, onto the solidification of the world, according to Guénon, it's the present is occurring within the present age which we inhabit, and as a manifestation inches away from the divine, the world, in some sense, quite literally becomes less qualitative and more quantitative. He states that as the age which we are in continues to deviate away from the principal pole of manifestation, which we could just call the divine, for lack of a better term, we descend toward this world which is losing its attachment to the immaterial and thus becoming more rigid and void of spiritual contact. The solidification of the world is also linked with the prior conception of ordinary life, which, to refresh your memory, is once again the illusion that either the spiritual domain does not exist, or it either is not present at all in our corporeal existence on a normal basis. This solidification of the world, which is not just, in a sense, the notion of divine silence, I guess we could also say it's a phenomenological point of view in humans where, because of the materialist outlook, all things become systematized and mechanistic, as all things are thought to be put into quantitative determination solely. All these outlooks also serve as the precondition for modern technical industry as well. I also want to emphasize here that Guénon also means by the notion of solidification that the barriers between the transcendent world and ours become thicker, making the world seem as if no divinity exists or immaterial ontologies either. However, the barriers are only thicker in this current period, and we're going to see later how they crack. Uh, and also obviously by barrier, he doesn't mean like a literal physical barrier. He just means kind of like this metaphysical, this immaterial kind of force field, I guess you could say, for lack of a better term. So man's attitude toward manifestation changes, and seeing the world as void can in many ways make it slightly more so. And we see an example of this in the fall of Adam, once again, like where his sin changes the world and the state of metaphysical affairs around us. Also, the materialist worldview uh, would make more men blind to the transcendent, and the solidification and divine withdrawal increases because they're not willing to communicate with the divine because they don't really see it as something that's there. So this, however, does not mean that divine are also, let's say, the opposite of divine, which is, sorry, let me repeat that. This, however, does not mean that the divine are also, let's say, the opposite of divine, but immaterial cannot penetrate this solid world. In fact, there are fissures, and Guénon talks about this, the fissures in the wall, or fissures in the Great Wall, rather. Moving on, Guénon talks about geology, and he says that there have been large-scale geographic shifts uh, that are more than just the movements of land masses. They are correlates with the natures of cycles which we inhabit, and obviously the cycle we are in. The same thing has also been the case in history and ancient civilizations. Many would object that archaeologists have not found any trace of such things, and Guénon would state that due to the present state of affairs, they will have, no trace will obviously be left. This is a bad argument in my opinion. It's really just an ad hoc fallacy, but whatever. He does make a better point. He says that when archaeologists do find things from the past civilizations, they interpret these things through their modern presuppositions, which clouds their reasoning. The same goes with their description of history. Now, you could just say, well, just because it's their presupposition doesn't mean that it's wrong. And of course, that's true. It doesn't mean it's wrong. But we would also say that the presuppositions they hold are wrong. They're not wrong because they're modern. They're wrong because they just don't. They're not metaphysically coherent. There's also a modern prejudice that the ancients did not know how to record history, and this kind of implies all ancients were, mentally afflicted. And there's no reason to believe this. If all the people of the past say the same thing, it may be, there's a high chance it could be the case that they were telling the truth if we see this continuity between, distinct texts and people who don't know each other. There's a good reason to believe that something did happen, like a universal flood or something of that sort. Now, the reason the moderns don't see the past the way the ancients did was because the past was so different, and genuine metaphysical changes have occurred, especially in the age we inhabit. There have been centers and places throughout history and the world that have had religious meanings to them. With the embracement of ordinary life, this becomes negated. Some examples of such places would be like Bethlehem, Mecca, certain rivers considered to be holy, like in India. I know there's one, I forgot the name about it. The modern man can't see the meaning of these places because they are so blinded in their worldview, and they have a damaged soul, essentially. They can't tell the difference between a holy and unholy place. This once again, let's see here. This once again also has to do with the solidification of the world, as it's hard to see holiness when the divine and the corporeal are in touch at the bare minimum. Yeah, so when they're reduced so far away, it's really hard to actually see what the primordial truth is. So Guénon wishes to put into symbolism the solidification of the world. He does this through using the two symbols of the sphere and the cube. The sphere represents the primordial transcendent form as it is least specified and particularized of all the forms, and it is the same on all sides, in all directions, much like an infinite God. The cube has the most defined edges and particularized and most constrained aspects of all other shapes. The sphere is essentially the egg of the world, or universal integrality or unification. Even for a moment, if we think about a sphere or a cube, a sphere is the most free as it can move on all its sides as slow or as fast as possible, whereas a square is arrested and rigid, thus it's more solid and stuck. So a perfect sphere is also never seen in the corporeal world, which makes it an even better symbol as it highlights its transcendent nature. The sphere would be the essential pole and the cube the substantial pole. The cube is the basis of all uh, existence, which is to say it is at the bottom of existence. When I say, yeah, by basis we don't mean it's superior, we just mean that it's at the bottom of all corporeal existence. It's that which the world is made out of. Substance, obviously. So whereas the sphere is that of essence and it's on the top. The cube has also been symbolic of the earth and the spheres of heaven, which also makes sense. The slowing down of the sphere, or wheel into square, is represented in the move from primordiality to the end of the world, and the square gets sublated, and thus the circle returns. So before we move on here, I do want to talk about the usage of the square being arrested, and like, okay, you might say, well, how can the square be arrested if it represents substance? Because substance is impotency, and how can something be potent and arrested? Well, uh, we would say that it's arrested because it's representing solidification, rather, and solidification still has, in order to be solidified, still has some connection to essence. So the square is it's not perfect pure quantity, rather it's representing deviation away from quality, and becomes more solidified and less in touch and free with the divine, is basically what he's saying. So he uses the symbols of minerals to also represent this, within the heavenly Jerusalem being transformed into a new paradise. So Guénon also touches on a paradox about the solidification of the world. That is, with modern industry, we have made travel and international communication much more easier, quote unquote, when in reality it has become harder, as in order to travel, one must engage in multiple checkpoints, and all spaces that were once free are no longer free, as it is brought into a systematic process where all things are looked at numerically and how they work efficiently. Things like nomadism or travel in general become nearly impossible or very tedious at this point. I mean, just how it is in an airport. It's a pain just to get anything, get anywhere. You have to go through all these different, systematic changes, and we're sitting here told that it's easier to go places now. So Cain and Abel, the story in the Bible, are also analogous to the cube and sphere. Cain is a farmer and Abel a stockmaster. One is sedentary and one is nomadic. These professions are also the two most primordial ones according to Guénon, as they are the oldest ones existing in our present humanity. We can infer that the sedentary Cain is representing solidification, and Abel its opposite. Cain is slaying Abel is symbolic of solidification overtaking the sphere. The farmers are more rigid as they don't move, and the nomads less rigid as they have all the space to move. He also talks about expansion and compression, or I should say dilation and contraction, in regards to time and space. Space is expanding and time is contracting, and time uses space, or uses space as its medium for being. So, moving on here, he also talks about space being correlated with sight and time with hearing. The sedentary peoples tend to make arts like architecture and sculpture and painting, and nomads the phonetic arts like music and poetry. Music presupposes time and art, and architecture space. So the nomads are more concerned with with temporality, and the farmers are more concerned with space. So there is also a paradox where those who work within time are stabilized or grounded in space, and those who work in space subject to change, which is of course time. This is because both are linked and needed for one another, obviously. We see this with the farmers. They have to keep up with time. They have to keep up with the change of seasons, and how they're going to take care of their livestock and all that. Space and time, or Cain and Abel in this case, their dialectical tension can be brought together through movement, as movement requires space. Objects to move must require space, and time, as movement is change, and change presupposes time. So they both require one another. So following on from this, Guénon talks about time changing into space. Time follows the principle of contradiction, which is to say it speeds up, of contraction, which is to say it speeds up until its own self-negation. Not only does time speed up quantitatively, or what the modern may think of as literally toward the end of a cycle. Because when I say literally, we just conflate quantitative determinations with literal determinations because we only see them as real. Anyway, um, as we get towards the end of the cycle, time becomes qualitatively faster as well as quantitatively faster. As the age ends, the nature of the events become quicker. I think it should also be mentioned that since, yeah, like I said, obviously because both quantity and quality are linked, it's also going to be both faster qualitatively and quantitatively. Let's see here. From the beginning of time, sorry, from the beginning of the cycle, uh, time speed is increasing, and time compresses space or encloses it as it speeds up, as if time and space are linked, and time exists in shorter intervals than so much space. Because so if space is, or rather, if time is shorter, space must be shorter because the more space, and remember because they're linked, the more space that exists, the more time that exists because there's more distance between two objects. So we see some everyday phenomena occurring in regards to shortening as the life of people decreases is one example of such a thing. Now this would be a quantitative example of a reduction toward or the path toward uh, contraction of space. As time keeps contracting, it will be reduced to a single instant where no duration will exist. Time comes to an end by ending itself or speeding up so much that it negates itself, very similar to the notion of self-undermining or self-relating negativity seen in the German idealists. Um, After time dies, there obviously will be no more. Sorry, after time dies, there will obviously be no more time left, and no more death either, as death presupposes time and age, and a death is a process of decay, and a process is time. So as time dies out, uh, it's going to transform into space. Space will eventually absorb time, and this is symbolic of Abel getting revenge on Cain. So space and time are united, but this doesn't mean they aren't distinct, obviously, and separable. And modern physics has the issue of considering this, so they consider time as a fourth dimension. It would be better, according to Guenon, to represent time as a fourth coordinate of space added to the three dimensions, as I guess he would say that the coordinate would be better as dimension in itself would already be space, so it would be a better way to distinguish space and time. A lot of physicists say that time should be considered a fourth coordinate, but it should be imaginable. It should be imaginable time, which is just to say that time is not a real phenomenon, but still a needed one, which is really an incoherent proposition. Because if this is a necessary presupposition, a logical presupposition, then why would you say it's imaginable or trivial? That doesn't work. A lot of physicists say that time should be considered a fourth coordinate, but it shouldn't be imagined. Oh, I already said that, sorry. As time ceases to exist, space must undergo a dilation or expansion because time no longer constrains it as it is sped up. So much that it has negated itself. Now space is free from the influence of time. Now obviously this is all very difficult for one to picture, as we are always in the corporeal domain of time, and it's part of our everyday existence. So when time is united, it's hard to see how space can exist without it and expand without time. And I just said before, obviously, that the more space you have, the more time you have. But in this case, it would just be space will get so big, it'll expand so much that time will basically become non-existent because it's just too big. Time will be too slow, essentially. So it's also interesting to note that at the end of the world is often seen as the end of time rather than space, and this was in the footnotes. And this is because time is that which carries all events and at once, and that closes all events as well. So thus we see an end to the world of events. As time negates, the primordial state of humanity comes back into being, what one may call heaven or paradise. Thus the symbolism of the passage from the heavenly Jerusalem to the terrestrial paradise is a perfect symbol. Or another symbol, imagine a circle with a dot in the middle, the dot being divinity, and God, the circumference of the circle being that which is the furthest away from God. Moving away from the center, which is God, to the circumference is symbolic of the fall, and moving back to the center is symbolic of the death of time. Time is obviously responsible for the movement away from the center, and when we return back to the center, it is not through time that this occurs, as we are not in that sense moving as a movement, as we are not in the sense moving as movement presupposes time, and time by its nature can't go back. We return to the center by time negating itself and space becoming without time, and thus timeless space is where we are, and the center of the world is timeless space from which the new humanity begins. Just to stop here for a second about we're not moving backwards, obviously, because moving back in time would violate the Leibnizian law of indiscernibles. You know, if you're moving back into space, well, if you're moving back into time, well, you're not. You're changing the events from what they were. Okay, well then these are two distinct times. Therefore, they're not the same thing. So this also solves the problem of how does space expand after time dies, as expansion requires time. We see that space expands in the sense that when time is negated, the constraint of space by time is no longer there, and space is completely free. So it isn't expanding through succession. Rather, by expanding we mean released from the contraction and restored to timelessness. Space expands right within the instant time dies, as it is no longer there to hold it by its throat. So death is also once again absent in the heaven, and man's experience is of a constant eternity. I just want to add one more thing here, that it makes sense that time is negated and space will expand, as space expansion would be a super slow occurrence. Time would be slower as more space exists, like I just said before, and eventually once space is maximally expanded, time would die. Less space is time at a higher speed, so the less space we have, the faster time is, like we just said, as less space would, for instance, make the difference between 2 points quicker than if there were more space. So more space creates slower time, eventually creating no time at all. It's important we distinguish between more and less, and faster and slower. They're not the same thing. So if we have more space, it would take more time to get from point 1 to point 2. But it taking more time would not mean that time, it would mean that time is slowed down as the distances are farther, requiring a more drawn-out process of passing the points. And the opposite is true, that less space would mean faster time. So if we had less space between point 1 and point 2, it would be quicker, and the points are closer, and obviously the events would occur quicker. So GUENON now addresses the paradox in his chapter titled Toward Disillusion. He says that as the world solidifies and becomes stable, we see the acceleration of time as well as the world becomes destroyed. But how is this possible? How are things becoming more rigid if time is speeding up? Wouldn't things being, moving all over the place if time was speeding up? So first of all, what must be understood is that even though the world is becoming more impenetrable and impermeable and solid and quantified, the world can never be fully quantified, and it still possesses some essence or nature derived from the essential pole of manifestation. It's the same reason extension is not pure quantity, and as extension has a qualitative determination, which is to say, it has an essence which is fixed or imposed on it from the domain of the essential pole of being, or being rather. Eventually, solidification reaches a point where it is reduced to its final point, and it breaks or dissolves. Or in other words, continuous quantity, which is number, is the perfect symbol because number is indefinite and it is a quantity. And when it is a quantity, it becomes discontinuous. As it becomes too solid, it is no longer its substantial form or qualitative form, and it evaporates, and thus we have an end to the corporeal manifestation itself. So yes, the world is solid while time is sped up, but as time speeds up, the solid world also dissolves into nothingness. So GUENON introduces to us the notion of the fissures in the Great Wall, which I mentioned hitherto, which is a result of the materialist phenomenology of modern man. And this materialist outlook creates a disconnect from the corporeal to the transcendent domain, in which a barrier is created. And this isn't just a way of saying man is not communicating with it. It almost becomes impossible, as the divine has withdrawn as man has destroyed the metaphysical state of affairs by his infidelity. Fissures still exist, though, and that which is not corporeal can come into the wall created, but this is never from above; it's always from below, as these are malevolent forces waiting to take advantage of the spiritually ignorant. Um, the wall the walls created by man's ignorance can, in a sense, be seen as a protection and limitation. Limitation for the reasons mentioned hitherto, but a protection as malefic forces cannot break through as easily as they could. However, the world is not completely separated from the transcendent domain. They can still break in. Symbolically speaking, the wall is open at the top, so the potential for divine communication is always there. But the wall created has its fissures always at the bottom, where the lower and more subtle or evil things come to pass. Thus, the wall acts as a protection, but it can falter. The fissures in the wall go back to the Kali Yuga, and at the time when the world was less solid, it was easier to repair the fissures as spiritual protection played a role. Now, it is harder to penetrate the wall because when it does happen, the materialist outlook uh, basically, which doesn't allow for anything supernatural to exist, such as the demonic, things are not taken seriously. So obviously the fissures, when they occur in the modern age, they go unnoticed, and therefore they're harder to fix. Let's see what else here. Often we see these fissures being accessed through the medium of the ignorant people who are neo-spiritualists. And they often, in good faith, have a perverted and subverted sense of the divine, and this allows evil and falsehood to be spewed. I should have said inverted instead of perverted, I'm sorry. They are pawns of evil without knowing it, quite often. Let's see. GUENON talks about the psychic residues, and this tends to pop up in the inverted spiritual movements as well, where the practitioners of certain seances project their own psychic understanding of spirituality, creating a false phenomena. These are the types of people who will help in opening some of the fissures mentioned before. As they're often engaging with a subverted notion of tradition, they allow evil to come into the world. What also must be said is that moderns conflate wanting to hide knowledge with wanting to monopolize it when it is actually to protect it. GUENON also talks how certain places have a spiritual meaning, and this goes back to sacred geography. GUENON talks about stages of anti-traditional action. He talks about how anti-traditional forces use human mediums to accomplish what it is they want to get done. What they desire to accomplish is to change the general mentality of people from traditional viewpoints to anti-traditional ones, and also to change the institutions and eventually turn them into counter-traditional ones. They often do this by adopting a pseudo-tradition, which GUENON calls counter-tradition or counter-initiation. GUENON talks about one of the early stages of anti-traditional action is the turn away from the transcendent toward the human, and thus the embracement of all things human, and thus we see the birth of humanism and things such as the Renaissance preferring individuality over and the human over God. And then with, once again, Descartes, we get mechanism, which slowly got worse and became materialism. As this happened, man adhered to quantitative science, which reinforced this notion. There's also a second part of anti-traditional action which transcends materialism, or in his words, transcends the notion of worldly solidification and toward worldly dissolution, which we spoke about previously. Quantitative science has become less materialistic due to the fact that it would predicate things to matter that are contrary to matter, actually. We see this a lot in quantum physics, and matter becomes more and more evanescent. We often see how modes of anti-tradition, which try and support a false sense of spirituality, and this goes back to the ideas of the fissures within the wall, where real evil and immaterial forces enter into manifestation. Do this by coming in the form of spiritual traditionals, which are not actual spiritual traditions. So we see a distinction between the stages of anti-traditional action. While they are distinct, they are also working in the same direction. Materialism was the first phase, and the false spirituality that comes next is the second phase. This brings us into the notion of subversion. There's a distinction between subversion and deviation. Deviation is considered to be a movement away from the center by a multiplicity of degrees. Some examples of this are humanism to rationalism, to mechanism to materialism, thus creating things like profane science, which are a deviation from perennial science. We can also see each deviation becomes more and more in line with the reign of quantity, but eventually it'll come in line with a false reign of quality, the subverted notion. After deviation occurs, once again, a sort of subversion, which isn't to say a reversal of the state of affairs occurs, but rather the state of affairs has reached a point where, in order to degrade it further from tradition, subverting tradition becomes the new modus operandi. This is what we see going on calls a spirit of negation, which is that which destroys all traditional truth and is therefore satanic. We see with Satan that he is a liar and even tries to pass himself off as that which he is not, but he also tries to pass himself off as the exact opposite of himself. It is said that Satan tries to make himself look like an angel of light. We thus can say subversion is satanic as it presents itself as following tradition, when in fact it is the exact opposite. Because the modern world has deviated so far, and after deviation things like subversion come, we have a false sense of knowledge or an imitation of knowledge, as we don't have a proper metaphysical paradigm anymore, and this once again limits us. So once again, first deviation comes, which is denial of tradition or anti-traditional action, and then we have subversion, which takes things like a false sense of spirituality and metaphysics and perpetuates them as real. It's why we see materialism first and then a fake religious movements like theosophy next. This also applies to symbolism. Symbols often are subverted and replaced with their opposite. However, we should take note that a symbol can have multiple meanings, and these meanings can be harmonized at a higher level, in which they no longer contradict. This would probably be how Guénon accounts for his perennialism, to be honest, and that he tried to say that, yeah, the religions contradict, but they can be in harmony at a higher level of principle. Oftentimes, the subverted nature of symbols may not be quite visible from the symbol alone, as for example, the serpent can have both benefic and malefic meanings. So we need to see how these symbols are being used to truly understand them and whether or not they are good or evil. The worst is when symbols of the past are viewed as something that they are not in the present. We may have one symbol that exists in the present and in the world of tradition, and we attribute the subverted notion that we have in the present to what they meant in the past. So we have a complete misunderstanding of past symbols because of the modern understanding which we have now. Following on, he makes a distinction between tradition and traditionalism. Often we see a notion of tradition projected from the present into the past, and therefore not an accurate notion of tradition, and thus another form of subversion, which is either a mistake or done out of ill intent. Because it is often so subverted and the water's muddy, nobody wants who wants to honestly embrace tradition can find the right place to turn anymore, or they very rarely end up in the correct spot because all notions have been so subverted from the original notion. These people try and offer up a solution to the ailments at hand, but they don't give us anything real, and all their notions of a solution are infantile, and these people are referred to as the quote-unquote traditionalists. They're not actually traditionalists, but they call themselves that. The traditionalists are merely those who have a sentimental attitude toward tradition, but because they are not guided by principles, because they don't know about them, they are often led astray to false paths. And in a lot of ways, the tradition is often brought down to the human level, where it becomes stripped of anything superhuman, and therefore accepts the infrahuman and the worst aspects of it, of course. There can never be a tradition which has roots, which has human roots rather. So phrases like scientific tradition or philosophic tradition cannot be traditions, as their genesis lay within that which is human. Tradition always stems from the superhuman or the essential pole and imposed on the substantial pole. So going further, as well, the clashing of ideas or ideas opposed to one another that have their origin in the modern world are not worth taking sides, as they all stem from the same rotten core, which in nature lacks any and all principle. Thus we see the birth of neo-spiritualism, of which there are two types, one of whom there is some vague spiritual belief, which is typically harmless, and in the other a tendency toward the worst kind of spiritual delusion. The latter has an obsession with anti-materialism and thinks that it is the only problem afflicting the modern world. Guénon does state that these people do make good mediums for bringing back traditional values, as they are opposed to a major part of anti-tradition, which is the materialism. And of course, the neo-spiritualists do engage in things that are going to help open the fissures in the wall, such as inverted practices and rites, and they'll practice Satanism and all that. We also see now science has transformed into a spiritual tradition. Things where they had this notion of mystical thinking associated with modern science, and we see this in the 21st century. Obviously, Guénon didn't talk about this with quantum mechanics and people like Deepak Chopra. or a lot of like these weird gurus you see now. We also see that now science has been transformed into a neo-spiritual thing where they have this notion of, I'm sorry, I just read that. We also see this aversion of the notion of metaphysics basically diverted from what was the study of reality based on first principles into the study of mystical science and all that subverted notions of tradition. He also talks about the misdeeds of psychoanalysis. He says that, like all modern science, uh, it reduces everything down to the human level. Furthermore, it always speaks of the subconscious rather than the superconscious. And this is just reflecting the modern tendency to think in a downward direction toward pure quantity or substance. These psychologists tend to elevate inferior human states as being profound and superior human states. They also reduce mysticism, religion, etc. to the unconscious, and whenever such a thing is occurring with the superconscious or through the superconscious, they reduce it to the unconscious. A perfect example of this is Carl Jung's archetypes, reducing the spiritual to the level of the collective unconscious, where universal patterns of human behavior have their origin and location. We also see here the psychological interpretation of symbols, and this Guénon calls satanic, as it imposes a subverted notion of what symbols are from the present into the past, negating their real meaning once again. Let's see. The psychologist always says that the spiritual is some sort of infrahuman thing that occurs within the basement of the human mind, which is to dethrone and subvert the true notion of symbolism. Now, obviously, this occurrence of subversion is another example of a fissure in the Great Wall. The patient of the psychologist often presupposes that they are afflicted or ill when they go in for treatment, so they therefore put trust in this practitioner when they become exposed to the malefic side of reality, which is the practitioner is being used as a medium for. Psychologists also tend to take things like yoga and turn them into some therapeutic practice without any consideration for their true meaning and purpose. The subtle subversive elements are in a sense more dangerous as they are not upfront about what they are. Rather, they are shrouding themselves in a veil that is not reflecting their true nature. Guénon states also that things like yoga are not a discipline meant for just anyone, and it is something that must occur in a person who is ready to engage in such a thing. But modern psychologists don't acknowledge this. The creed of psychoanalysis states that a psychologist must always be analyzed himself, and this shows how the discipline is resembling a sort of initiate organization, but a subverted one, thus making it satanic. We often see a confusion between the psychic and the spiritual, where psychic things are said to be spirit when this is entirely wrong. So we have a conflation previously with the spiritual to the psychic, with people like, we could say, Jung reducing all spiritual things down to like biological representations, and thus we get a conflation now with the psychic to the spiritual, where people take this kind of goes back to the psychic residues, where they take that which is in the mind and impose it on the objective world. And I think Guénon goes further into this. If you're interested in this idea, he talks about it in his book called The Spiritist Fallacy, which, yeah, it goes into a lot of this stuff. Of course, all of this is, once again, malefic or satanic, and often these spiritual movements that consider themselves to be psychic, or that consider the psychic to be spiritual, rather, they often harm those engaging in them who seek to become spiritually enlightened. The distinction between the two, once again, is that the psychologist will see that all spiritual things are false and bring them down to the human level, and the spiritualists see all things as superhuman and take even the psychic and call that spiritual when the psychic is really just human. Both have opposite worldviews, but they have the same outcome, which is a subverted notion of spirituality. So often he states that the psychic phenomena are conflated with the spiritual because the psychic phenomena may be less prevalent in the average man, just like the spiritual is. Often these people are chasing the feeling of sensation than of true spiritual development. Now, this is not true spiritual development whatsoever. In fact, it's a reverse of spiritual development, as it occurs instead of coming close to the center of your soul, you're actually shifting away from the center towards the circumference of that circle, going back to that symbol. So we see this with the adoption of counter traditions. He gives an example of people adopting things like pantheism. He doesn't name him, but obviously a thinker would be like Spinoza. They also conflate psychic influences with spiritual ones. I went over that again. And this also leads them on the path to self-annihilation. And we see them try and justify these things with notions such as the universal consciousness. Following on from the notion, counter or pseudo-traditions, we are met with what naturally follows from them, which is a subverted notion or deceptive notion of prophecy. According to GUENON, prophecy can be that which has its origins in a holy text, and all other forms of prophecy can only be considered predictions, more or less. The modern phenomena of such predictions are ones seen in science, which, to its credit, should be allowed to make these. However, one needs to understand that all scientific inquiry presupposes a set of preconditions for the possibility of science in the first place. In the case of the counter-traditional quote-unquote prophecies, we see they are usually contained with such prophecies that are not very clear, or they're very vague or whatever, and often whenever one wants to is projected onto these vague visions. Often people are attracted to this because it's a spectacle and it's attractive to the layman who knows no better. We often see pseudo-initiates reading into the past false prophecies and understanding of history, such is the case with those who say that the British are the lost tribes of Israel. So yeah, you have this this projection of false notion of symbolism back into the past. Well, the same thing here applies with prophecies. So prophecies in many ways are also symbolic. So those are also linked. GUENON speaks about the passage from anti-traditional to counter-tradition. He states that according to real prophecies, after anti-tradition has been established, the more dishonest and subversive element, which we call counter-tradition, will take place, but not for a total amount of time, because at some point the higher order will come to destroy them and rectify the world back into its primordial state. Now, obviously, counter-tradition is much more than just a human social construct. It is in nature located within the satanic domain, but it's expressed through the human being. The humans are used as a puppet for these satanic ends. The attraction toward the spectacle of counter-tradition leads one down to the infrahuman, as one tries to reach the gates of heaven through an illegitimate way, and they are thus closed off. The counter-tradition once again appears as if it is the strongest of all conditions, but it will too eventually be subject to divine will and intervention. It's going to be destroyed. This kind of goes back to like the beast in the book of Revelation, that kind of seems like for a while it's going to triumph, but in the end Christ comes back to destroy the beast. Many people believe that good and bad have the same ontological status, and this notion is prevalent among those who are engaged in a counter-traditional behavior, or counter-traditional who accept counter-traditional ideas, such as Manichaean dualism. This conclusion stems from the rejection of principal unity and the embracement of irreducible dualism. As we mentioned previously, anti-traditional action must occur first in order for counter-traditional action, as counter-traditional action must, in a nominal sense, reject anti-tradition and say its ideas are wrong and embrace ideas that are anti-traditional, but in a different sense. It rejects the hitherto form of materialistic anti-tradition and it embraces counterfeit tradition. So both anti-tradition and counter-tradition, they're both anti-traditions. However, anti-tradition, the first one, is materialistic, and counter-tradition is also an anti-tradition, but its modus operandi is different. It undermines tradition through taking it and subverting it. The reign of the Antichrist is also similar to the reign of the anti-tradition, like I just mentioned before. GUENON also states much like how there was a Christ who was an incarnation of tradition, there will also be an Antichrist who is the figurehead of counter-tradition and will be an impostor who has a following which is one of spiritually subverted subjects. The reign of the Antichrist and counter-tradition is not a reign of quantity, as they reject the tendency to reduce all things down to quantity and instead embraces spiritual restoration, but one, of course, that is counterfeit. The Antichrist will be in the incarnation of all inverted symbols. He's the manifestation of all inverted symbols into one being. He will have no successor or predecessor in nature. As him being Antichrist, he will make himself appear as a Messiah while being the exact opposite. The Antichrist is the manifestation of disillusion, as he will be the final form before the end of the age we are in. He is not solidification, as he is not engaged in the quantitative, because he wholeheartedly accepts the qualitative, just an inverted notion of it. Thus, the Antichrist will also promise a false golden age. Now we move on to what GUENON calls the end of a world, not to be confused with the end of the world, because when one is strapped in the phenomenological state of the current age, they view the age as the only world in which we exist. So its ending seems like a total ending. The primordial state of man is neither in the past or future, it is always ahead of us and behind us, in the sense that cyclic time has a primordial state that we came from, that we lost, but we will always come back to in the end. While we move toward the new golden age, we also move away from the previous one, or rather, its older rendition. If we go back into the past far enough, we will return to the golden age. If we go into the future, we will also return to the golden age. As cyclic time is closed and inescapable, it always leads to the same place. It should be mentioned that the shift toward the new cycle will be one that concerns a new humanity and the new origin story, not the current one which we have now. So no one alive now is going to experience the new golden age. That's how you would know that it's a false prophecy if someone was to promote that, I guess. It should be mentioned that the shift toward the new cycle, sorry, I already read that. Much like those who are blinded by the quote-unquote ordinary life, we see a similar blind spot occur with the counter-traditionalists as they adopt a false metaphysical doctrine based on corporeal existence, which they can't see out of. For example, dualism, like we just mentioned, they can't see past the distinction and how it is all related and united in one existence. When one takes the Kali Yuga on its own, they see it as an evil, as it represents degeneration. However, when we see it in the context of the whole of the cycle, as an age which leads to a golden age, we see that this quote-unquote evil aspect really plays along in the whole divine plan, which ultimately exists to produce new cycles, to manifest itself and its glory into. Now this is interesting. This is like, you can actually use that in a way to solve the problem of evil. Like, okay, well, the evil only exists because it's leading to something higher and truly good. This higher understanding of the cycles is also a higher understanding of principal unity, where all oppositions are united in the end. This is where the Neoplatonism is coming in again. He also says that the benefic and malefic, i.e. good and bad, are only correlative, really, and in the end don't mean much, as the malefic only exists as a passive shadow state that has no real potency or power, whereas the benefic does. But the benefic only becomes apparent when the malefic and transitory state is present in the other ages. Thus, he says that the end of the world we inhabit is nothing other than the end of an illusion, as it only has an existence in a higher unified form, which to the average person is not obvious. And yeah, so that completes the overview of the reign of quantity and the signs of the times. I think it's a very good book. I think it's a very unique book. I think everyone should read it. Even if you're like an atheist or whatever, I think you'd get a lot out of it. You might find it interesting. You would understand like a traditionalist perspective. I do like doing these unscripted videos. I'm probably going to start doing more of them with longer books. Like if I ever do a video on Kant, I'll have to do a video like this. There's no way I can do a scripted video. But yeah, so I hope you enjoyed this. There's going to be some future stuff coming out, maybe another interview or whatever. And so do me a favor, please subscribe and share this stuff. I do appreciate your help and support. We're almost at 1,000 subscribers here, so that would be appreciated. Your help and support would really be appreciated. So yeah, thank you.